The African wilderness was still. A vast expanse of golden grass swayed gently under the cool morning breeze, and the distant call of a bird echoed through the crisp air. The Kafue National Park in Zambia had always been a place of breathtaking beauty, a land where time seemed to stretch endlessly, where the wild reigned supreme. But that morning, something shattered the serenity, a single gunshot. It wasn't the kind of gunfire that echoed proudly across the plains when a hunter claimed their prize. It wasn't a celebratory shot, nor one of warning. It was sharp, sudden, and final. Within minutes, the camp stirred. Guides and staff exchanged uneasy glances, their movements quickening as they rushed toward the source of the sound. The hunting lodge was one of the more secluded ones, nestled deep in the heart of the wilderness, meant for those who sought adventure away from prying eyes. One of the park rangers was the first to reach the cabin. He hesitated, hand hovering over his radio before pushing the wooden door open. The metallic scent of blood filled his nostrils immediately. His gaze fell upon a figure sprawled on the floor, a woman, her dark hair cascading over her shoulder, her clothes soaked in crimson. Standing near the body was a man, his hands trembling as he lowered the shotgun. His face, lined with years of success and privilege, was now contorted in something between shock and despair. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, almost distant. "She shot herself," he muttered. The ranger's eyes darted back to the woman. He had seen hunting accidents before. Careless fingers, misfired shots. But something about this scene gnawed at him. The wound was too precise, the angle unnatural. Outside, the wilderness remained indifferent. The wind rustled through the trees. The animals continued their lives as if nothing had happened. But inside that cabin, in that moment, something was deeply, profoundly wrong. The room was silent except for the heavy breathing of the man standing over the body. The ranger's grip on his radio tightened as he took in the scene. The woman on the floor, her still body unnaturally twisted, was Bianca Rudolph, a seasoned hunter, a woman familiar with firearms. Yet here she was, lifeless, with a gunshot wound that didn't quite make sense. Larry Rudolph, her husband of more than 3 decades, wiped a hand over his face. His eyes were red, but no tears fell. He sucked in a shaky breath and turned to the ranger. "It was an accident," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was packing up her rifle. The trigger must have gone off." The ranger didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the shotgun, its long barrel resting near Bianca's body. Something wasn't right. He had seen accidents before, hunters who underestimated the power of their own weapons, but something about this one felt off. A second ranger entered, pausing at the threshold before stepping inside. He muttered something in the local dialect, exchanging a glance with his colleague. Both men had worked at the lodge for years. They had seen their fair share of hunting mishaps. But this? The first ranger finally spoke. "You said she was packing up the gun?" His voice was steady, measured. Larry nodded. "Yeah, we were supposed to leave today. She must have been in a rush. I was in the bathroom, and then I heard the shot. When I came out, she was—" He exhaled sharply and gestured toward Bianca's body. The ranger crouched down, examining the wound. He wasn't a forensic expert, but he knew enough about guns. The placement of the injury was odd. A self-inflicted shot from a rifle that long would have required an almost impossible angle. He stood up slowly. "We need to report this," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Larry's expression darkened for just a moment before he nodded. "Of course," he said, running a hand through his short cropped hair. "I understand." Outside, the Zambian sun had risen fully, casting a golden glow over the landscape. Birds took flight in the distance, oblivious to the fact that, inside the lodge, a woman who should not have been dead lay motionless on the floor. The news of Bianca Rudolph's death spread quickly through the hunting camp. Whispers floated between the staff, the local guides exchanging glances, their voices hushed with suspicion. Accidents happened in the wild, misfires, reckless mistakes. But something about this one didn't sit right. 2 rangers remained inside the cabin, assessing the scene, while a third stepped outside to radio for law enforcement. Larry Rudolph stood off to the side, arms crossed, jaw tight. His breathing had steadied, but his expression remained unreadable. Shock, perhaps, or something else. The lead ranger finally broke the silence. Dr. Rudolph, we need to document everything before making any conclusions. Standard procedure. Larry nodded stiffly. Of course, he said, his voice clipped. I understand. Still, he hovered near the body as if he expected them to move faster. One of the rangers took a careful step closer to Bianca. The blood had pooled beneath her, soaking into the wooden floor. Her hands were still, her face turned slightly to the side, eyes closed. The wound was brutal, but there was something strange about it. She shot herself while packing the gun, the second ranger asked, crouching down. Larry exhaled sharply. Yes. The ranger studied him. With that rifle? He motioned toward the shotgun lying nearby. It's a long weapon. If she was standing, the angle... He trailed off, hesitant to voice what was already forming in his mind. Larry's lips parted as if ready to argue, but then he simply shook his head. I don't know what to tell you. I wasn't there when it happened. The first ranger exchanged a look with his partner before carefully picking up the shotgun. He inspected it, noting the safety switch, the condition of the trigger. The firearm was in pristine condition, no scratches, no sign of struggle, nothing to indicate Bianca had fought against it. Outside, the third ranger returned, his radio still in hand. I contacted local authorities. They'll be sending someone. Larry's head snapped toward him. How long? A few hours, maybe longer. Something flickered across Larry's face. Hours? The ranger shrugged. We're deep in the park. Takes time. Larry pressed his lips into a thin line. Listen, I have to get my wife home. I need to make arrangements. Can't we just... He gestured vaguely at the body. I mean, if you all believe this was an accident, I can start the process now. We don't need to drag this out. The room tensed. She's not going anywhere until the authorities arrive, the ranger said firmly. Larry clenched his jaw. I understand, he muttered, though his stance suggested otherwise. The rangers continued documenting the scene. They took photos, measured the distance from the weapon to the body, noted the placement of furniture, the untouched luggage. Bianca had been preparing to leave. The bags were neatly packed in the corner. There was no sign of chaos, no evidence that she had been handling the gun in a rush. But what stood out the most was the wound itself. A self-inflicted rifle shot should have left gunpowder residue on her hands. Blood spatter should have matched a closer-range blast. The entry wound was too precise, too direct. None of it made sense, and yet Larry was already making calls. He had contacted the U.S. Embassy before the authorities had even arrived. He was already asking about the process of hastening the cremation. The rangers exchanged one last look before stepping outside, leaving Larry alone in the cabin with his wife's lifeless body. As they walked away, one of them muttered under his breath, "This doesn't feel right." The air inside the lodge had turned thick with the metallic scent of blood, mingling with the faint aroma of gunpowder. Outside, the vast wilderness of Zambia stretched endlessly, unbothered by the human tragedy unfolding within its borders. But inside, beneath the wooden beams and the hunting trophies that lined the walls, something wasn't right. The rangers could feel it in their bones. Larry Rudolph stood near the door, his phone in hand, his fingers moving swiftly over the screen. His voice was hushed, but the rangers picked up snippets of his conversation. Words like embassy, arrangements, cremation, all of it spoken with the urgency of a man who was more concerned about logistics than grief. One of the rangers, a man who had worked in the park for years, studied him carefully. He had seen how men reacted to loss, the way their hands shook uncontrollably, the way their voices cracked under the weight of unspeakable grief. He had seen husbands collapse beside their fallen wives, fathers crumble under the unbearable reality of losing a child. But Larry Rudolph, his movements were too controlled, his tone too even. His grief, if there was any, seemed measured. A short while later, a group of local authorities arrived, their demeanor professional but wary. One of them, a senior officer with sharp eyes, surveyed the scene before approaching Larry. "Dr. Rudolph," he greeted, his voice carrying a polite formality. "I understand you were the only one present when this happened?" Larry nodded. "I was in the bathroom when I heard the shot," he said smoothly, repeating his story without hesitation. "When I came out, she was on the floor. It was too late." The officer glanced at Bianca's body before turning back to Larry. And she was handling the gun? Larry exhaled, his frustration barely concealed. Yes, she must have been packing it, and something went wrong. It was an accident. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked past Larry, toward the rangers who had first arrived on the scene. One of them stepped forward. We examined the weapon, the ranger said. It's a long-barreled shotgun. If she were packing it when it discharged, the trajectory of the wound. He hesitated. It doesn't line up. Larry's eyes narrowed slightly. What are you saying? The officer's gaze remained unreadable. We're saying it warrants a closer look. A flicker of something crossed Larry's face. Annoyance, perhaps, or something darker, but he quickly masked it. I understand, but I need to take my wife home. I've already contacted the embassy. We're making arrangements for cremation. The officer's brow lifted slightly. Cremation? Yes, Larry said. It's what she would have wanted. The ranger shifted uncomfortably. Something about the speed of it all felt wrong. The authorities had only just arrived, and yet Larry was already pushing for finality, for closure. We still need to conduct a full examination, the officer said. Larry's jaw tensed. I understand, he repeated, though his body language suggested otherwise. The process moved forward, but unease lingered. As Bianca's body was prepared for transport, one of the authorities made a quiet note of something. There was no gunpowder residue on her hands. A hunter, a seasoned shooter, a woman who supposedly shot herself. Yet there was no trace of discharge on her skin. And just like that, the first undeniable crack in Larry's story appeared. Bianca Rudolph's body was barely laid to rest when the first whispers of doubt reached the United States. It began as an unease among those who had known her best, longtime friends who struggled to reconcile the official story with the woman they had known for decades. Bianca was experienced with firearms, meticulous in her habits, and careful by nature. The idea that she would make such a fatal mistake while packing up her own gun seemed almost absurd. The news of her sudden death had spread quickly through their social circles, and it didn't take long before suspicions turned into something more. A close friend, someone who had spoken to Bianca just days before her trip, was the first to act. Unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, she picked up the phone and made a call that would change everything. The FBI office in Denver received the tip with cautious interest. It wasn't every day that someone called in to suggest a wealthy American dentist had staged his wife's death in a foreign country, but the agent who took the call knew better than to dismiss it outright. Over the years, she had seen her fair share of suspicious deaths that initially seemed like accidents, only to unravel into something far more sinister. A preliminary check into Larry Rudolph's actions in the days following his wife's death raised immediate red flags. He had moved swiftly, too swiftly. The embassy in Zambia confirmed that he had pushed aggressively for Bianca's body to be cremated as soon as possible, waiving an autopsy that might have answered lingering questions. It was unusual, even in cases of genuine accidents, for a grieving husband to be so singularly focused on finalizing his spouse's remains before an investigation could be fully conducted. More troubling still were the financial records. Within weeks of Bianca's passing, Larry had filed multiple claims against her life insurance policies, the total payout reaching nearly $5 million. The policies, spread across several companies, had been in place for years, but the sheer speed at which he moved to collect raised eyebrows. Insurance fraud wasn't uncommon, and any time a death led to an unusually large payout, it warranted closer scrutiny. But what truly set the wheels in motion was something far more personal. As investigators dug into Larry's life in the wake of Bianca's death, they discovered something that had remained hidden for years, something that could shift the entire perspective of the case. Larry had a long-term mistress. The woman's name was Lori Milliron, and she was far more than just a casual affair. Their relationship had spanned years, woven into the very fabric of Larry's life, while Bianca was still alive. Lori had been a quiet presence in the background, someone who existed just outside the edges of suspicion. But in the months following Bianca's death, she had stepped into the foreground, moving into Larry's home in Arizona, as though she had always belonged there. To those who had known Bianca, this revelation was the final confirmation that something wasn't right. The speed at which Larry had transitioned from grieving husband to a man openly sharing his life with another woman sent a clear message. This was not the behavior of someone mourning an accident. The FBI formally opened an investigation. Agents began combing through records, retracing Larry's steps in Zambia, speaking with insurance companies, and reaching out to those who had been closest to Bianca. The rangers at the hunting lodge were contacted for further statements. One by one, the small inconsistencies in Larry's story began to pile up. The most damning revelation came from the forensic analysis of Bianca's death. Though her body had been cremated, photographic evidence and initial reports from Zambia painted a picture that was hard to ignore. The wound was too precise. The lack of gunpowder residue on her hands was impossible to explain if she had truly fired the weapon herself. Experts in ballistics examined the trajectory of the shot, and their conclusions were chilling. Bianca had not fired that gun. Somewhere between the hunting trip and the insurance claims, between the tears Larry had shed and the new life he was building, a truth had been buried. But now the ground beneath him was beginning to shift. The FBI wasn't just interested anymore. They were watching. The deeper the FBI dug into Larry Rudolph's life, the more unsettling details they uncovered. What had begun as a single tip from a concerned friend had evolved into a full-scale investigation, with agents meticulously piecing together the final days of Bianca Rudolph's life. The discrepancies in Larry's story had been apparent from the start, but now the emerging timeline of events painted an even darker picture, one that suggested intent, planning, and a chilling lack of remorse. Investigators first turned their attention to the hunting lodge in Zambia, the last place Bianca had been seen alive. The lodge staff had spoken briefly to local authorities in the immediate aftermath of her death, providing general statements that supported Larry's version of events: an accident, a tragic misfire, a moment of carelessness. But now, under the scrutiny of an active FBI investigation, their recollections became more precise, more revealing. One of the rangers who had responded to the gunshot described a feeling of unease from the moment he entered the cabin. The scene had been too orderly, too controlled. A fatal gunshot wound from a hunting rifle should have resulted in a chaotic aftermath, yet nothing in the cabin suggested a struggle or panic. Bianca's packed luggage remained undisturbed, the firearm rested neatly nearby, and most notably, there was no clear evidence that she had even been handling the weapon. The inconsistencies extended beyond the physical evidence. Larry's behavior in the hours after Bianca's death had raised eyebrows. While most grieving spouses were consumed by shock and devastation, Larry had been composed, methodical. He had made immediate calls to the U.S. Embassy, pushing aggressively for Bianca's body to be cremated before a thorough autopsy could be conducted. He had refused offers of assistance from local authorities, insisting that he could handle the arrangements on his own. Within hours of his wife's passing, he was already speaking to insurance representatives, inquiring about how soon he could file his claims. As the FBI gathered more witness statements, a disturbing pattern emerged, one that suggested Larry's concern had never been about Bianca, but rather about how quickly he could erase any lingering questions surrounding her death. The financial aspect of the case was equally damning. A forensic accounting team was assigned to examine Larry's financial transactions in the months leading up to Bianca's death. What they found was a trail of meticulous planning. He had not only increased Bianca's life insurance coverage in the years prior, but he had also taken out multiple overlapping policies, ensuring that in the event of her death, he would receive a payout of nearly $5 million. It was a calculated move, one that pointed not to a grieving husband, but to a man who had prepared for this outcome long before it happened. The timeline of Larry's personal life further complicated his alibi. His long-term mistress, Lori Maliron, had not only been aware of Bianca's death almost immediately, but had also begun making significant changes to her own life in the days following. Investigators uncovered financial transactions linking Larry to Lori, including expensive gifts, large cash withdrawals, and real estate searches that suggested he had been preparing for a future without Bianca well before her fatal trip to Zambia. Yet despite the mounting evidence, the case was still fragile. Bianca's body had been cremated, eliminating crucial forensic opportunities. Larry had maintained his composure through every round of questioning, never once slipping into inconsistency. There were no direct witnesses, no security footage, no smoking gun, Only a series of seemingly coincidental details that, when placed together, formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. The FBI knew they needed more. They needed a definitive link between Larry's financial motives and the moment of Bianca's death. They needed someone who had heard him speak openly, someone who could confirm what they already suspected. And so they turned their attention to Lori Milleran. If Larry had shared his intentions with anyone, it would have been her. And if there was even the slightest crack in her story, the FBI was determined to find it. As the FBI tightened its focus on Larry Rudolph's actions in the months leading up to Bianca's death, one name kept surfacing: Lori Milleran. She was no secret to those who had known Larry well, though her existence had been carefully kept in the background for years. To the outside world, Larry and Bianca had been a successful, affluent couple, deeply connected through their shared love of travel and big game hunting. But beneath that carefully maintained image, there had been another woman lingering just beyond the periphery of Bianca's life. Lori had been more than an affair. She had been woven into the very fabric of Larry's day-to-day world. She had worked alongside him, had traveled with him, had been part of the life he kept separate from his marriage. And now, in the wake of Bianca's death, she had stepped into a role that could no longer be ignored. Investigators began analyzing her movements, her financial records, her communications with Larry both before and after Bianca's passing. What they found was a pattern that hinted at far more than a simple romantic entanglement. In the months before the Zambia trip, Larry had made significant financial gestures toward Lori. There were withdrawals of large sums of money, some of which coincided suspiciously with dates on which key life insurance policies had been finalized. There were luxury purchases, ones that spoke to a future Larry was preparing to share with someone other than his wife. Most telling of all was the fact that Lori, unlike Bianca's grieving friends and family, had not been blindsided by the news of Bianca's passing. She had known almost immediately. The nature of Lori's relationship with Larry wasn't just a betrayal of marriage. It was a window into his mindset. She had been the person he had confided in, the person he had planned for, the person whose presence in his life had grown stronger in direct correlation to the distance he had placed between himself and Bianca. If there was anyone who knew the truth about Larry's motivations, it was her. But knowing and proving were two very different things. The FBI needed something tangible, something that would tie Lori not just to Larry, but to his intentions. They began the slow, meticulous process of mapping her interactions with him. Phone records, text messages, emails, anything that could provide insight into what she had known and when she had known it. What they discovered wasn't just circumstantial, it was damning. In the days following Bianca's death, Lori had begun making arrangements of her own. She had spoken with real estate agents, inquiring about high-end properties. She had made financial adjustments, shifting assets in ways that suggested a long-term plan. More importantly, she had spoken with Larry in conversations that, though seemingly coded, carried undertones of anticipation rather than grief. It wasn't enough to arrest her, but it was enough to pressure her. The FBI's approach was deliberate. They wanted Lori to feel the weight of the investigation, to understand that every dollar she had accepted, every call she had made, every step she had taken after Bianca's death was now being scrutinized. They wanted her to know that her future was no longer tied to Larry's protection, because Larry himself was no longer untouchable. Lori wasn't officially a suspect, but she was something just as valuable: leverage. And in cases like this, leverage often led to the one thing the FBI needed most: a confession. The FBI had built cases before, cases against criminals who thought they were untouchable, who believed that money and power could shield them from consequence. But this case was different. This was not a violent crime committed in the heat of passion or a reckless mistake that spiraled out of control. If their suspicions were correct, Bianca Rudolph's death had been planned, executed with precision, and buried under layers of misdirection. The difficulty wasn't in proving that something was wrong. It was in proving exactly how it had been done. Larry Rudolph had been careful. He had ensured that Bianca's body was cremated quickly, eliminating the possibility of a second autopsy. He had woven a narrative of a tragic accident before anyone could question it. He had taken immediate control of the situation, moving the process along before doubt could set in. On paper, it looked like an open and shut case of misfortune. But what Larry hadn't accounted for was the weight of accumulating suspicion, the way small inconsistencies would begin to stack until they collapsed under their own weight. Forensic experts were the first to dismantle Larry's story. Though Bianca's body had been reduced to ashes, the photographic evidence taken before her cremation remained. The gunshot wound was examined by experts in ballistics and wound trajectory. They reconstructed the likely angle of the shot, factoring in the length of the weapon, the positioning of the body, and the physics of gun recoil. The conclusion was inescapable. Bianca could not have shot herself in the manner described. The entry wound, the trajectory, the lack of gunpowder residue on her hands, none of it supported the idea of an accidental discharge. Then came the financial records. The sheer speed with which Larry had moved to collect the insurance money sent a clear signal to investigators. Life insurance payouts were routine in unexpected deaths, but Larry's case wasn't routine. He had filed claims within days before Bianca's ashes had even cooled. The insurance companies, now cooperating with federal investigators, provided records that showed just how much preparation had gone into securing those policies. Some had been adjusted in the years leading up to Bianca's death, increasing their payouts. Others had been taken out long before, designed to appear innocuous until viewed through the lens of hindsight. The combination of forensic evidence and financial records painted a picture of a man who had meticulously planned for an outcome that should have been unpredictable. But even that wasn't enough. The FBI needed a direct connection, something that tied Larry to intent, to premeditation, to the decision that Bianca Rudolph would not be coming home from Zambia alive. That was when they turned back to Lori Millerin. Lori had become a central figure in the investigation, not because she had pulled the trigger, but because she was proof of what Larry had planned to do next. She had been his confidant, his companion in a life that no longer included Bianca. Her financial transactions, her correspondence with Larry, the lifestyle she had stepped into after Bianca's death, all of it pointed to someone who had been waiting for this moment. The FBI began tracking Lori's movements, studying her behavior, looking for cracks in her carefully guarded exterior. They needed pressure points, signs of uncertainty, indications that she knew more than she was willing to say, and soon enough, they found them. A former employee from Larry's dental practice came forward, describing conversations she had overheard in the months before Bianca's death. She recalled the way Lori had spoken about the future, the way Larry had reassured her that everything would be taken care of. It wasn't a confession, but it was a thread, one that, if pulled correctly, could unravel the entire case. The FBI knew they had their suspect. Now they just needed him to make a mistake. The FBI had seen cases like this before, meticulously planned, disguised as accidents, with just enough plausible deniability to cast doubt on foul play. But no crime was perfect, and the weight of evidence, no matter how circumstantial at first, had a way of pressing down until the truth revealed itself. Larry Rudolph had constructed a narrative of tragedy, had controlled the way Bianca's death was perceived from the very beginning, but he hadn't accounted for one simple fact. A man who had nothing to hide wouldn't need to move so quickly. The forensic inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. The lack of gunpowder residue on Bianca's hands should have been enough to warrant a deeper investigation from the start, but even more telling was the physics of the shot itself. The rifle Larry claimed had accidentally discharged was long-barreled, a weapon designed for distance, not close-range firing. Ballistics experts studied the entry wound, factoring in the angle, the positioning, the recoil. Their conclusion remained the same. Bianca could not have fired that weapon herself. That alone wasn't a conviction, but it was a foundation. From there, the case built itself piece by piece. The insurance payouts were scrutinized again, and this time, with the cooperation of multiple agencies, a pattern emerged. Larry had been the sole beneficiary of Bianca's policies, a sum that exceeded $5 million across multiple claims. His urgency in securing the payout wasn't just unusual, it was aggressive. He had filed the paperwork almost immediately after Bianca's death, before law enforcement had even completed their initial reports. Some of the policies had been adjusted in the years leading up to the Zambia trip, increasing their payouts under the guise of standard financial planning. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about the way Larry had moved forward after Bianca's death, as though he had already prepared for a life without her. Lori Maliron, his longtime mistress, had become the focal point of the FBI's efforts. She wasn't just a lover, she was an integral part of Larry's world, woven into his daily life, a presence that could no longer be ignored. When investigators examined her financial records, they found significant transactions, cash withdrawals, wire transfers, purchases that suggested a life being built alongside Larry's, one that had seemingly been in place even before Bianca was gone. The employees at Larry's dental practice painted an even clearer picture. Some recalled Lori's influence, the way she carried herself as more than just an office manager. One employee in particular remembered conversations that had taken place in the months leading up to Bianca's death. There had been talk about the future, about decisions being made, subtle remarks that, in hindsight, carried a darker meaning. The FBI knew they were close, but Larry Rudolph wasn't a man who panicked. He had built a career on control, on carefully measured responses. He knew how to navigate scrutiny, how to maintain an air of credibility. And for now, he remained exactly where he had been since the beginning, untouched by formal charges, insulated by the lack of direct witnesses, shielded by the absence of a confession. That was what the FBI needed. They had the motive, they had the financial trail, they had forensic analysis that undermined Larry's version of events, but they needed something irrefutable. A slip-up, a contradiction, a moment where Larry said the wrong thing to the wrong person. And so they set the trap. A plan was put in motion, a way to bring Lori Maliron into the conversation in a setting she wouldn't anticipate. Agents began making quiet inquiries, ensuring word would reach her that the investigation was closing in. They wanted pressure, the kind that made people reckless. They wanted Lori to feel the weight of what was coming, because sooner or later, someone was going to break. And when they did, Larry Rudolph's carefully constructed alibi would collapse around him. For months, Larry Rudolph had been careful. He had watched as the whispers grew into questions, as questions became an investigation, as agents began peeling back the layers of his life. He had prepared for scrutiny, had measured his words, had ensured there were no direct witnesses to contradict his version of events. But what he hadn't accounted for, what no criminal ever truly prepared for, was the weight of his own arrogance. The FBI knew that proving intent in a case like this was difficult. There was no murder weapon to analyze, no direct confession, no eyewitness who had seen the fatal moment inside that hunting lodge. But there was something just as powerful, a man who thought he had gotten away with it. Larry had settled back into his life in the United States without hesitation. Within months of Bianca's death, he was openly living with Lori Maliron, making expensive purchases, speaking as though the future had always been meant to unfold this way. He wasn't grieving, he was celebrating, and that was where his mistakes began. Federal agents had been watching him closely. They monitored his financial activity, tracking the money that had once belonged to Bianca now flowing freely into a new life. They studied his movements, noting his confidence, the ease with which he seemed to believe he was beyond reach. He wasn't a man living in fear of being caught. He was a man who had convinced himself he never would be. And then there was Lori. Unlike Larry, Lori didn't have the same level of control. She had been careful, yes, but she wasn't untouchable. Investigators had already built a case around her, financial records, witness testimony, and now the carefully constructed pressure of a federal investigation closing in. She hadn't been charged with anything yet, but she could feel it coming. Her once certain future with Larry was beginning to unravel, and the weight of knowing that her name was now permanently linked to his crime was pressing down on her in ways she hadn't expected. It started small, whispers of concern from her attorneys, subtle inquiries from investigators who weren't asking if she was guilty, but how much she had known. Then came the strategic leaks to the press, carefully placed stories that hinted at new developments, unnamed sources suggesting that Lori Maliron might not be just an accomplice, but a key figure in bringing Larry Rudolph to justice. It wasn't true. Yet. But the FBI wasn't after Lori for what she had done. They were after her for what she knew. And then came the mistake. Larry, for all his caution, for all his careful planning, had one fatal flaw. He underestimated the people around him. He believed that because he had controlled the narrative for so long, it would never slip out of his grasp. He thought Lori was as invested in protecting their future as he was. But Lori wasn't like Larry. She hadn't built a life around deception, hadn't structured her existence around the idea that consequences could be avoided if one was simply careful enough. The FBI had set a trap, and Larry walked right into it. During a routine surveillance operation, agents overheard a conversation at a small cafe where Larry and Lori had met for lunch. It was supposed to be casual, just another day, another meal, another quiet moment between two people who had built a life out of secrecy. But what Larry didn't know was that someone else had been listening. A witness sitting nearby later recalled the moment clearly. The shift in Lori's voice, the hesitation, the way she asked, "But what if they prove it wasn't an accident?" The way Larry had paused, the way he had leaned in, lowering his voice, the way he had muttered, "They won't." It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was close, and the FBI wasn't done. Agents began circling Lori more aggressively, making it clear that she was no longer just a person of interest. She was a liability. They wanted her to feel it, to understand that Larry wasn't the only one facing consequences. They wanted her to know that if she didn't act soon, she wouldn't have the option to act at all. The pressure mounted. Lori withdrew. Her once unwavering confidence in Larry began to crack, little by little, as the reality of what they were up against set in. And then, just as the FBI had anticipated, Larry made the final mistake they needed. He had always been careful with his words, but now, with the walls closing in, he became reckless. Surveillance captured a conversation in which he acknowledged the investigation was getting too close, in which he admitted that Bianca's death was something he needed to put behind him. It wasn't a confession of guilt, but it was the moment he lost control of the story, the moment the FBI knew, without a doubt, that it was time to move in. The moment Larry Rudolph stepped into the courtroom, the weight of the case against him became undeniable. The room was filled with reporters, legal teams, and federal agents who had spent years building the case that had led to this moment. This was no longer a quiet investigation happening behind the scenes. It was now a public reckoning, a trial that would determine whether Bianca Rudolph's death had been a tragic accident or a cold-blooded murder. Larry had walked into court with the same confidence he had always carried, head high, jaw set, dressed in the tailored suit of a man who still believed he could talk his way out of anything. But this was different. The weight of forensic evidence, financial records, and witness testimony was stacked against him. And despite his composure, he knew the government had spent years ensuring that once this case reached a jury, there would be no room for doubt. The prosecution wasted no time. They began by dismantling the foundation of Larry's alibi. They walked the jury through the forensic inconsistencies, the lack of gunpowder residue on Bianca's hands, the impossibility of her shooting herself with a long-barreled shotgun at the angle required for the wound. Experts in ballistics testified that the trajectory of the shot was inconsistent with an accident, that the physics of the discharge simply didn't support Larry's version of events. Bianca hadn't accidentally shot herself. Someone else had pulled that trigger. Then came the financial records. Prosecutors presented years of insurance policies, highlighting the timing of adjustments that had dramatically increased their payouts. Bianca's death wasn't just tragic, it had been profitable. They showed bank statements, wire transfers, real estate searches, painting a clear picture of a man who had already been planning for a future without his wife before she had ever boarded a plane to Zambia. And then there was Lori Myron. She had not been charged with murder, but her presence loomed over the trial. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, how Larry had begun living with her almost immediately after Bianca's death, how their financial ties deepened in the months following, how conversations between them had hinted at a future free of complications. They played surveillance audio from the cafe, the moment when Lori had asked, "But what if they prove it wasn't an accident?" The moment Larry had replied, "They won't." It wasn't a confession, but it was close. The defense did what they could. They argued that the prosecution was piecing together circumstantial evidence, that no one had seen Larry fire the gun, that no one could say with absolute certainty what had happened inside that cabin. They brought in their own experts to suggest alternative explanations for the gunshot wound, to cast doubt on the forensic conclusions. They argued that grief was complicated, that a man moving on quickly didn't mean he had committed a crime. But then came the moment the prosecution had been waiting for, A former employee of Larry's dental practice took the stand. She had worked for him for years, had seen the way he and Lori interacted, had overheard conversations she had never thought twice about, until now. She recalled the way Larry had spoken about his marriage, how he had joked that Bianca wouldn't be around much longer, how Lori had laughed as if it were something they both understood. And then, she repeated the words that sent a hush through the courtroom. Months before Bianca's death, Larry had been discussing finances when he had said, "It's going to be taken care of soon." It was a small moment, a seemingly throwaway comment in an office full of employees, too busy to pay attention. But now in the courtroom, it was the closest thing to a premeditated confession the prosecution could have asked for. The defense scrambled, arguing that it was hearsay, that it meant nothing. But the damage had been done. The jury had heard it. And now they had to ask themselves, if Bianca's death was truly an accident, why had her husband spoken as though he had already planned for it? As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution delivered its final blow. They played a recorded phone call Larry had made from jail after his arrest. In it, he had spoken about the case with cold detachment. He hadn't asked how his children were handling the trial, hadn't spoken about the loss of his wife. Instead, he had spoken about logistics, about what would happen next, about how much time he might serve, about whether Lori would remain loyal. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, their verdict was clear. Guilty. Larry Rudolph had spent years believing he had covered his tracks, that no one would ever piece together the truth. But in the end, it hadn't been one single piece of evidence that had convicted him. It had been the accumulation of everything, the forensic inconsistencies, the money, the mistress, the words he had spoken when he thought no one was paying attention. The illusion of innocence had finally shattered, and Larry Rudolph, once a wealthy and respected man, was now nothing more than a convicted murderer. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. The weight of the verdict had already settled over everyone in attendance, but this was the moment of finality, the moment where Larry Rudolph, once a successful dentist, a man who had lived a life of wealth and luxury, would come face to face with the consequences of what he had done. When the judge spoke, there was no room for negotiation, no space for leniency. Life in prison, no chance of parole, the maximum sentence for murder. In addition, another 20 years for fraud, a charge stemming from the millions he had collected from Bianca's life insurance policies under false pretenses. It was a punishment designed to ensure that Larry would never again walk free, that he would live out the rest of his days behind bars, stripped of everything he had built his life around. He did not react at first. No outburst, no plea for mercy. Perhaps he had already known this was coming, had already resigned himself to a fate he could no longer escape. Or perhaps, even in that moment, he still believed himself too smart, too untouchable, too important to be left in a prison cell for the rest of his life. Lori Milliron, the woman who had stood by him, had not escaped unscathed. She had been convicted of obstruction of justice and perjury, sentenced to 17 years in federal prison, not for pulling the trigger, but for being complicit in the lies that had followed. For Bianca's family, it was a measure of justice. It would never bring her back, never erase the pain of losing her, never undo the betrayal of a man she had trusted for decades. But it was justice nonetheless. The truth had been exposed, and Larry Rudolph had been held accountable. In the years to come, the case would be studied, analyzed, held up as an example of how even the most carefully orchestrated crimes leave behind traces, small inconsistencies, overlooked details, the arrogance of a killer who believed he was smarter than everyone else. It was proof that justice, no matter how delayed, could still prevail. But beyond the crime itself, beyond the courtroom and the headlines, the case of Bianca Rudolph carried a deeper lesson. It was a reminder that deception, no matter how expertly crafted, always has a cost. That those who build their lives on lies, on manipulation, on greed, will eventually watch it all crumble. Larry had spent years constructing an illusion, convincing himself that he could control every aspect of the narrative. But in the end, the truth had found a way through. Bianca had deserved more than the fate she had been given. She had deserved a life free from betrayal, free from the cold calculations of a man who had seen her not as a wife, but as a financial opportunity. And though she had been taken too soon, her story had ensured that the man who had wronged her would never have the chance to hurt another person again. As Larry Rudolph was led from the courtroom, shackled and silent, the final chapter of his life had begun. Not in the lavish home he had planned to share with his mistress, not in the world of luxury he had once known, but in a prison cell where the only future left for him was the weight of his own choices. And that was the price of deception. The truth, in the end, had won. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.